Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Cornerstones. As you know, as many of you may know, Deaf Cornerstones is our deaf program for training. It's hard and soft skills for VC, angels, and entrepreneurs. We do 101 courses and 201, and maybe we haven't done any 301, but we'll get there. So it's going to be basics, and we're going to keep moving up to more advanced topics. And we do hard and soft. So, for example, hard skills is like, I would call today kind of hard skill because you're learning a substantive area that's important for your business. But we do soft skills like what's it like to be an employee at a startup? That's soft skills that are very important. So we do those two. And we have a pitch night program. We have two separate types of pitch nights. We have one for venture capital, angel raises, and another for government contracting, government contractors, where they don't always go out to the market to raise money. They get money from government contracts. So we have a mock government contract officer, somebody with a lot of experience. We're just starting that one. We haven't done one yet. In a few weeks, we'll start. And we're going to have a mock government contracting officer who with a lot of experience and give you feedback. So you can practice your government pitches. Another goal of ours at Cornerstones is to give a platform for all of you for visibility. So if any member wants to talk about their area of specialty, get out there, get known, become a thought leader. That's part of our mission. And also anything you want to hear about or learn about that is hasn't been put on our agenda, you're welcome to. And we've done a lot of these if you're new, and they're available recorded. We did pricing, financial modeling, and others. So they're available, and some are for government contractors, like specifically, and some are not. Like so, it's just both. So I just wanted to hand it over to Alex Gorsuch, who's one of our members, and he's going to be leading soon a 4-week workshop on government funding issues, and I'm going to let him introduce it because it's coming up, and then I'll introduce Becky, our speaker.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Jed. So I'm Alex Gorsuch. I run the Champaign-Urbana Agora. And as Jed said, I'm going to be running an upcoming 4-week SBIR sprint. Essentially, this will run on Tuesdays in July, starting on the 6th, and it'll run from 1500 to 1700 Eastern. And essentially, the goal of this is to go from teams who have little to no understanding of what the SBIR process is, how to make a competitive proposal, and how to really prepare their venture for success. On the first week, we're going to talk about the overview of the SBIRs as well as a readiness self-assessment. Week 2, we're going to talk team, tech, and traction. Week 3, we're going to talk budgeting and formatting. And then in week 4, we're going to go moving beyond SBIRs and really have that full proposal ready to go. So it is a very intense course. There's quite a bit of homework, so it's not for the faint of heart, but it is intended to get teams with a full fundable proposal in 28 days.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. We'll look forward to getting more updates on that, even though a lot of it's already set up because I've seen on the schedule and everything. It's going to be a great event. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Becky Aistrup. And Becky is the managing partner and co-owner of BBC Entrepreneurial Training and Consulting, or BBC, etc. And she's known for government funding and grants, particularly SBIR and STTR. She serves on the proposal review panels often at the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, USDA. She's got 30 years of experience. She was the head of the SBIR and STTR program in the state of Minnesota. So, 30 years of experience, we're going to get a lot of great information. She's also a member of Grip Venture Studio, which is a accelerator alternative. It's like a la carte accelerator where you can pick and choose world-class advisors for marketing, financial advisory, fundraising, all of it. www.gripventure.com. I actually work with her there. That's how I got to know her and know how good she is at this topic. And also, I wanted to tell everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and then I'll ask them at the end. She'll talk for 30 minutes plus or whatever it is, and then we'll have opportunities for Q&A And you have her email here, so you can do any follow-up with her. And get ready to take notes. Okay, I'll hand it over to Becky now. Thank you for taking the time, Becky. We really appreciate it. We know how busy you are.
Thanks a lot, Jed. I appreciate being here. And for those of you going for 21.2, hopefully you already submitted. Otherwise, what are you doing here right now? But it's kind of a crazy time for getting submissions in. So I appreciate you taking the time to attend. So I just want to, again, what I'm going to talk about maybe is a little bit basic for some of you and maybe not for others, because there's a lot of nuances around the SBIR and STTR programs. So BBC is, I'm managing partner of BBC ETC, Entrepreneurial Training and Consulting, and our primary focus is non-dilutive funding for R&D through the federal government. So we do work on SBIR and STTR, CDMRP, BARDA, some of the other non-dilutive funding to help companies write competitive proposals and get the funding, and then get them into phase 3 commercialization. So we really push toward getting you actually to that next stage that the SBIR program is for. So for those of you not real familiar with the program, it's what they call America's Seed Fund. It's the largest seed fund, non-dilutive in the United States at about 3.6 billion. It's actually higher than that at this point. And the acronyms stand for Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer. For the most part, when I'm talking today, the two are pretty much interchangeable. I'll specify where the differences are, but they are two separate pieces of legislation and two separate programs that are mandated by legislation. And they come up for authorization every few years, and it's been a continuing issue since the 1980s. They have to go through continuing resolutions and finally get reauthorized. There is a push right now to get them authorized permanently in Congress, and that would be a great move. But essentially, the whole program is intended to help small businesses be innovative and move things quickly out to solve problems that are identified by agencies of the federal government. So any agency in the government that has extramural research budget that exceeds certain thresholds have to participate. They don't have a choice. It's a set aside, it's mandated, they can't opt out of the program. So for this SBIR or SBIR program, there are 11 agencies that participate because they have over $100 million worth of SBIR, extramural R&D funding. There are 5 agencies that are even larger that do over $1 billion, and they also participate in the sister program, STTR. And the way it's structured is it's mandated by legislation. There is legislation that authorizes the program, but then the Small Business Administration oversees the program, its implementation, and all the compliance. And there's a lot of those kind of things that you have to be sure are appropriate for you and your company before you undertake this effort. So I do spend a few minutes on that, because if you're not eligible, you certainly don't want to mess with everything that's involved with this program. So the SBA basically issues, what's the definition of a small business for purposes of this, who can participate, ownership issues, etc. So like I said, it's congressionally mandated, and the SBIR program is 3.2% of each agency's extramural R&D budget. STTR is 0.45% as of now. And that seems like a huge difference, but because of the differences that I'll talk about here and who qualifies and who ought to go for each program, surprisingly, your likelihood of winning is about the same for both approaches. So, you really need to pick based on topics and what's the most appropriate for your company, rather than because you think you have a bigger chance with SBIR than STTR. So again, who participates? Like I said, they're all federal agencies, and there are 11 that participate. DOD is, of course, the big kahuna, as they are in many things. In 2019, they had about $2 billion, and that's continuing to go up. Health and Human Services is the other fairly large player with over $1 billion. And then Department of Energy, NSF, and NASA also participate in both. Then there's some smaller agencies like Agriculture, Homeland Security, Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, Education, Transportation, Standards and Technology, and EPA that also participate in the program. And the reason that I'm taking your time to even tell you about all these agencies is there's a lot of overlap in what they're interested in. So you probably have an opportunity to apply for funding for more than one agency. And there can be some real advantages to doing that. So it's at least a good idea to open your mind to thinking about which agencies have problems that you can solve. And that may be something that's appropriate for you to pursue then. And the agencies have a tremendous number of differences. This is a very bureaucratic process that you really have to pay attention to the rules and the regulations and the instructions. And it includes everything from how many times a year they solicit. For example, DOD and NIH do it 3 times a year, where others like USDA and NASA only do 1 a year. The success rates, which actually for phase 1 tend to hover on average around 12 to 15% of applications for phase 1 are awarded. And it's fairly continuous, although it depends on what the budget cycle looks like and a number of other things as well. But some offer gap funding, which means that between phases of the tranches of funding that you get, you can actually get gap funding or continuation funding to take you beyond a standard phase 2. So you have to really know your agency and what it is they offer, what they're looking for. And even more complicated is when you're with the larger agencies like DOD, each component is different. Every program is different. The same at National Institutes of Health. Every institute and center tends to have their own special programs and rules. So you really have to be on the ball and not assume because you wrote a great funded DOD SBIR project that you're going to get the same type of project funded at NSF. So the purposes are mainly, like I said, to strengthen the role of small business, but to stimulate technological innovation. And I stress these points because they're built into the name and they're integral to this whole program. So there has to be an innovative science technology involved in what you're doing. If you're not advancing state-of-the-art of science, you're probably not appropriate for a SBIR award. The other thing is that they wanted to increase the commercial application of this research. So you have to identify what the end application is, who's going to buy it, what's your route to market. In other words, you have to have a commercialization plan for what they're funding in order to get the funding from the agency. And, you know, why should you even mess with it? Because like I said, it's a tremendous amount of rules and regulations and registrations and things you have to take care of. Well, the main reason is because, you know, we all know that there's a couple of key kinds of funding for commercialization. You can go out and take loans. You can give up equity in your company. You either have to pay it back or give up ownership. But then there is a category of non-dilutive funding, which SBIR and STTR fall into, that gives you some real advantages because you don't have to pay it back. You don't have to give up any equity in your firm. A couple of other advantages of it is all of us are going to have to go out and get additional funding. This program alone will not take you all the way to a TRL-9 product ready to be deployed in the field. So you have to get additional funding. This helps validate it. So investors and others see that you've been vetted, your technology has been vetted, you've been funded by these programs of the federal government. It helps you with additional funding and de-risk that development because, again, of course, their whole assessment for this is when investors come in is how much risk, and that's going to determine how much they'll give you and how much they want back. The other thing is that if you have relationships with the university, or some of you may be at a university as a researcher, it enables the transfer of that technology from the university into a small business who can then take it to that commercial stage. So, you know, we're all familiar with the whole concept of the Valley of Death. So, you know, you have your research, you have the Valley of Death where it's too risky, nobody wants to fund you. And that's the product development stage that the SBIR and STTR program will come in and help you. But I want to really stress that you have to look at this as one element of your funding strategy. It is not the only element. So all the other connections you're making through DEF and through the various organizations are going to help you with the rest of that. This isn't going to get you the whole way there. You're going to have to raise money or find other sources of revenue to get you all the way to that technology readiness level that, for example, that DOD wants. And that it not only is it about that, but it's about more than just science. Now, I have no doubt many of you have incredible, innovative ideas that could serve the warfighter and be of great benefit to the U.S., but it's about more than that. If you haven't figured out a way to turn that into a definable product with a value proposition and a way to reach a customer, they're not apt to fund you. You might get funded on a phase one, but they're not going to take you further in the funding process if you can't define that. So what do you have to have in order to do this? First of all, I obviously have to define your project. What is it that you want to do your R&D on? So the project has to be product development. So note the word product, based on technological innovation with a credible commercialization strategy. So all of those elements have to be in play for what you're proposing to do in order for it to be appropriate for this particular program. And the way you're going to get the money is similar to other kinds of investment, where they're going to typically give it to you in tranches. And by the way, everything I say is typically, because there's always exceptions. There are different programs, things that change what I'm saying. But for the most part, you're going to get phase one funding, which is a feasibility study. And that's where you're going to prove the feasibility of your technology. Feasibility for what? The feasibility to do whatever you say you're going to do in that phase two project. So what do you have to do to demonstrate that when you get the larger tranche of money, that this is a feasible thing and it makes sense for you to do? And they always stressed, I've been in this program, by the way, since about 1979, when it was a pilot program for National Science Foundation. SBIR didn't even exist. And they've stressed even back to then the importance of this being 3 phases. And in ways that seems like a misnomer, because if you look at those little yellow boxes, you see that when you get to phase 3, they ain't giving you any money. That you're on your own. But it tells you the mindset and the strategy that they had as they developed this, that this was the important element of it, and that the other 2 phases led up to the ultimate phase 3 commercialization. So typically what you're going to be doing is establishing your technical merit and feasibility with that phase 1 money. And the current recommended cap by SBA is $256,000 for 6 to 12 months. And you have to be successful. You have to demonstrate feasibility, which means you have to, when you write your proposal, make sure you're designating very clearly what the measurable outcomes for success are that you're building into the project, because that's going to show that, yes, I did what I said I do. Now give me the phase 2. Then the phase 2 is the continued effort. And now in this case, you're going to get about $1.5 million for a couple of years. And then there is potential, by the way, for gap funding that takes you even beyond that phase 2. And I'll talk a little bit about that as it pertains to DOD. And then phase 3 is where you get to the final commercialization. Now, no government agency can fund commercialization out of their SBIR STTR set-aside dollars. However, they can become your commercialization partner, as is typical with DOD. So even though they're not funding it through SBIR STTR funds, they can do additional funding to advance your technology further, to improve the technology readiness level, and to basically just take it toward what they need in the field. And phase 3, by the way, particularly for those of you who are really DOD centric, has a tremendous value to you. And I call it the golden ticket. And it's basically written into the SBIR and STTR law. And even though it's in the law, by the way, some of this is not necessarily known well by acquisition people. So it's really important that you understand what your rights are, what the program offers you, so that you can protect your rights and get the value out of doing this program. So first, just starting with the definition that's in the legislation of what phase 3 is work that derives from, extends, or completes efforts performed under prior SBIR funding agreements and is funded by other than SBIR phase 1 or 2 funds. So let me build a couple of things into that. That means that I potentially could have done a phase 1 with NSF. And DOD later wants to commercialize what came out of that. And that would still constitute a phase 3 commercial commercialization project. So it doesn't have to be phase 2. It doesn't have to be from the same agency. As long as it's applicable and the government entity is purchasing it, that could be additional work to further the R&D, and it could be based on any kind of acquisition mechanism, including OTAs, which, as we know, are becoming much more prolific. So what does it give you as a company? So phase 3 offers you, this is, again, starts to define the golden ticket, the sole source federal contracts. So once you are designated as it's a phase 3 project, DOD must give you preference to purchase that, or they have to explain to Congress why they didn't. So it gives you the right to bid sole source without bidding against anybody else. In order for this to happen, though, that means that you have to know what you have to do, which includes marking things that relate to the phase 3. And if you don't mark it, realize it gives them unlimited data rights. So as of right now, for those of you who participate in the program, if you haven't done that, you can go back 6 months and correct any marking errors and make sure that you noted that. The other benefits of the phase 3 is that there's no limit on them. You can get as many phase 3s from any phase 1 or phase 2 as they're willing to award you. There's no limit on the type of agreement, no limit on the dollar value. It can be funded by a different agency than the one that funded your SBIR awards, and the data rights are provided for 20 years from that initial award. So it's called the protection period. After that, the government does have government purpose rights after the protection period, but that gives you a 20-year time frame to make hay, if you will. The other thing is that there's no limit on the time that can elapse. So if your company did a phase 1 or phase 2 SBIR 5 years ago, and now you're bringing it to commercialization, or 20 years ago, there's no limit on that time frame that can elapse between the phase, between any phase and the phase 3. And the small business size limits also don't apply. So if in that 5-year, 20-year, whatever period, your company has grown and you're bigger than 500 employees, that's fine. And the affiliation rule has no application either. So where this really struck me about why it's a golden ticket is reading a press release a few years ago that says Lockheed Martin wins $300 million sole source SBIR award. And I'm thinking, okay, obviously Lockheed Martin isn't a small business. How does this work? So you look into it more, and what happened was a SBIR company developed something that Air Force was interested in and wanted to buy. That company developed some things with the SBIR, and Lockheed Martin purchased the company. The rights to that phase 3 protection and benefits then accrued to Lockheed Martin. Tell me how much more you think that the owners of that company got from Lockheed Martin because Lockheed Martin could do sole source bidding. So you can see that this is a way to greatly increase your value in your company, particularly if your ultimate plan is to sell to the federal government. So that's, so you understand why I call the phase 3 the golden ticket. So let's get a little bit more back to the basics too. Are you eligible to even participate? Well, you have to have a business. So if you're established, for example, at a university as a researcher, you still have to form a business entity to participate. It has to be organized for profit. It has to be in the US. It has to be primarily owned by US individuals. So that means the US citizens or permanent residents, if I look at your cap table, must be the primary owners. The company has to be based in the US, although you don't have to have all your operations here, but the work that you do on the SBIR or STTR project must be done in the US. You also have to have company controlled research space. You cannot be entirely virtual. You have to have an office, you have to be an entity, and some of that gets a little bit tricky from time to time. And then finally, you have to have a variety of registrations with the government to submit a proposal and accept an award. So that's just what you got to do to submit. In order to receive an award and be competitive, you're going to need more, obviously. You're going to need a team of people. You've got to have those facilities I talked about. And there's other resources you're going to need to convince the reviewers that you can pull this off. So think about it. You're going to need employees, and those may be senior or non-senior people. They typically are going to have domain expertise, and many times those people are going, one of the principal investigator will be among those people if you're doing a SBIR that's a requirement. You can also, though, the government realizes you're a little bitty company. You may be me, myself, and I. You don't necessarily have everything you need to do the project. So they allow you to bring in independent consultants to provide specialized expertise, as well as subcontractors, which could be a university or government research laboratory can serve as a subcontractor on the project as well. In that case, they're making a sizable contribution and they're working with you on the intellectual property. Unlike if somebody is coming in and machining a part for you, that is just a fee for service. Otherwise, these people are actually contributing to the project. And then you probably also have advisors, those who work with you, so you know how to sell to DOD and all the filing intellectual property and all the things that you have to know to move this kind of technology forward. And they typically are going to be available as needed. Now, I do want to stress that all of this is contingent upon you getting the award. So you don't have to actually pull the trigger and hire employees before you get the award. This is what they call a just-in-time requirement. So, at that point, you have got to have a designated principal investigator with technical skill to advance the state of the art. If you are doing a SBIR, SBIR, the principal investigator must be primarily employed by the small business at the time of award. In other words, at least 51% of his or her time has to be employed by the company, although not necessarily all on this project. And they could spend 49% of their time doing something else, but it does preclude full-time employment elsewhere. So you can't just say, I'm willing to work 80 hours and call yourself a PI. Again, that's a just-in-time requirement. All the other employees and people on the project don't have that same percentage employment requirement, but they do have to be W-2 employees employed by the company to count on the company's side of the budget. The PI is, like I said, needs to be somebody who's responsible for project planning, direction, technical expertise. It becomes the primary contact with the agency as well. They have to be an employee of the company legally empowered to work in the US. And you'll need other resources as well. A lot of companies have scientific advisory board who may be people that you're not paying to do billable work on a project, but they're helping keep you competitive. They're keeping you up to date. They're providing a lot of benefits to you as a company. Same thing with the commercialization and business resources. You hopefully have some kind of company management team. You may have developed strategic partners. You may be using outside resources like attorneys, accountants, and others that are advising and assisting your company toward commercialization. And it's important for the reviewers to be aware of that kind of support that you have too. As I mentioned, you have to have some company facilities at the time of award. Those have to be company controlled, that is suitable to do the work that you're proposing to do. So that means that the company needs to be able to show paperwork that demonstrates to the government that you have the right to do the work in the space and that you control it when you're there. That's why it's very difficult to demonstrate company control if it's going to be your back bedroom. And certainly you can't demonstrate company control if it's just at the end of your lab bench at the university. So you have to think ahead of time about what right you have to use that facility and be able to demonstrate that your company has that right. And this is something, again, that you have to pull the trigger on only when you get the award. You don't have to obtain the space before you pursue the project. I've mentioned several times that there's two sister programs, SBIR and STTR, and almost all the same rules apply. One difference is who could be the PI. For every agency except National Science Foundation, who has their own rules on it, the PI on a SBIR must be employed at the company at the time of award. For a STTR, that person can potentially be working at the university and be the PI. And so how much we can outsource to the research institution, who can be the PI. So this is kind of a cheat sheet, if you will. So for SBIR, you can partner. STTR requires it. It has to be a nonprofit research institution like a university. The company must do 2/3 of the work in a phase 1 based on dollars, half of a phase 2 based on dollars, and have a principal and investigator primarily employed at the company. Now, if you do a STTR, the percentages change. The company still has to exist, have facilities, have people, and do 40% of the work, but 30% has to be done by a nonprofit research institution partner. And the PI in most cases can be employed either by the research institution or by your company. The exception, as I mentioned, is National Science Foundation, which requires that the principal investigator always be employed by the company. If you have a PI on an STTR that stays at the university, they have to spend at least 10% of their effort on this particular project. So typical arrangements, if you're, for example, coming out of a university and perhaps a lot of your team really isn't ready to leave their day job, is that you may look at retired faculty. You may talk to a well-qualified postdoc who's willing to come out and be the PI on your project. You can take a leave of absence. You could leave the academic position or reduce your academic effort below 50%. But all of these are required, and if you violate these are absolute requirements. These are jailable offenses if you violate them. So you've got to make sure that you're following those rules. If you're going to do an STTR, remember that the company is still the applicant. It's not the university. You still need a company, you still need facilities, you still need people, but you have the right to use facilities, a much larger percentage, and potentially have your principal investigator at the university. So how would you pick which one to do? Well, first of all, does the agency offer it? I showed you that only 5 of the 11 agencies offer it. So that decides for the smaller ones. Is the topic that you want to respond to offered under both mechanisms? Because, for example, with DOD, SBIR and STTR topics are different from each other. So you have to apply for whatever mechanism that topic is listed under. And then the other thing is that with granting agencies, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, you could actually pick in many cases whether you do a SBIR or a STTR. So in that case, you want to look internally and see, what do you have? What do you need? Where's the work going to be done? What are the gaps that you have to make a full team and a complete project? And also just never be afraid to talk to the agency. And they can often give you a guideline. For example, I've had clients, particularly with, say, NIH, that contacted the program officer, said, well, within our institute, we haven't spent our allocation on an STTR, so your chance is higher on an STTR than it is an SBIR. And only they could tell you something like that. So there is an advantage to being sure you've talked to the agency and understand where they are in the process, and they're there to help you. Now, so why would you want to do a STTR? Well, if you don't have a good PI, if you don't have the highly qualified scientists employed by the company, or because you need specific lab space equipment or facilities, that would be a good, strong reason to work with the university. So now you've been through all the stuff to determine, yes, I'm eligible. It's an appropriate thing. Yes, it's an element of my funding strategy. I understand where the gaps will be. I want to pursue this. You got to figure out who's going to pay you to do it. And remember, as we talked about, there's 11 agencies that participate, and they all have slightly different rules, and they certainly have different objectives of the kinds of things that they want to fund. So as I mentioned before, the receipt dates, whether they enter an agreement with you that's a contract or a grant, because we always think of this as SBIR grants. Many agencies issue it as a contract. So and that is up to the agency which way they choose to do it. How do they do their review process? What areas do they fund? What is the size of the awards? What's the success rate? Do they provide gap funding? So these are all things that you need to be aware of for the specific agency that you're pursuing. And typically, if you are working with an agency that plans to purchase what you have, they're an acquiring agency, if you will, like Department of Defense or NASA, they typically will will issue all of their awards as contracts. Other agencies that don't tend to buy things like National Institutes of Health and NSF, USDA, tend to fund grants. There is a small contract program with NIH, but for the most part, their SBIR and STTR programs are run as grants. Well, who cares? Well, you care when you're writing the proposal because this really helps direct how you write it, who the reviewer is going to be, and how you position your project. So if you're going for DOD or a contracting agency, they are going to tell you a topic. They're going to tell you what the requirements are, and you have to fall within that. Now, they may have some open, broad topics, particularly in the past few years, they've added more of those. But nonetheless, you still have to comply with what they're asking for, and there has to be a solicitation. So if my biodegradable bullet casing should be interesting to DOD, but I never see a solicitation for it, I don't have anything I can apply for. There's no unsolicited proposals for SBIR and STTR. They use it as a procurement mechanism, which means that there's a few more strings attached, a few more fiscal requirements. And so you also are going to be reviewed by internal reviewers, where granting agencies are broad topics that the investigator or the company proposes what the problem is and what you're going to do about it. And they are reviewed by by peer review personnel. So when you think about the fact that you need to get through that review process, you got to think about who the reviewer is. And it's a different set of people for granting agencies versus contracting agencies. So that impacts the way you position it and who you're writing toward. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes on something a little bit more specific. And I'm just very briefly going to tell you about National Science Foundation. It's one of those agencies that has great application across a lot of different technology areas. And when you look at this broad, wide open objective of NSF, progress of science, national health, prosperity, welfare, secure national defense, it's everything. I'm sure all of you have something that could fit into that. So how do they make their decision about what they fund? Well, again, it's a granting agency, so they're looking for you to come and make proposals to them. But they have a very strong emphasis on two things: commercialization and innovation. So if what you're doing isn't revolutionary versus evolutionary, NSF's probably not going to be interested in it. Other agencies may be interested in incremental improvements and evolutionary science, but NSF typically isn't going to be. So they also are the most focused on a strong commercialization plan, which seems a little contrary that you're early in the process, but you've got to have a good, strong commercialization plan. That's the way they operate. That's the way they narrow down what they're going to fund. But if you fall into that category, it can be a great source of initial funding. But it does have to have that high degree of technical risk. And again, you know, yes, we like to convince them we can do this, but if there is no risk, it's not a SBIR award. And that there does have to be a potential for significant commercial impact. So it's going to move the needle once you've commercialized what you're doing. NSF's budget allocation for these is $256,000 for the phase 1 and $1 million for the phase 2. So they're a little bit smaller than some agencies, but they, like I said, they fund almost everything. So they typically revise this list regularly. They have 23 specific topic categories. You can read about the kinds of things they've funded there, identify who the program manager that handles that specific topic category. That's the way that they divide their work at NSF, but realize they always have one in there called other topics. So if you don't see a topic that you think fits, you still want to talk to NSF and see if they're interested. Now they require you to put in a project pitch before you can submit your project. So you have to actually get their permission to submit a phase 1 proposal where they tell you, yeah, we're interested in what you're doing. So it's a little different process than any of the other agencies as well. But like I said, it's a potentially great funding source for a lot of different technologies. The only other agency I'm going to go into in a little detail is, of course, DOD. DOD is, of course, a contracting agency, unlike NSF. So there you're responding to their needs, their topics, their definition of what the problem is. They typically have 3 standard phase 1 deadlines annually. As you all know, one's coming up here very shortly. And those dates vary a little bit. And unlike NIH that always uses exactly the same dates, they tend to vary. You have to keep your eye on that. You can submit as many proposals in one cycle as you'd like, unlike NSF where you cannot do that. But then they also have all these weird twists and turns that at DOD you need to be familiar with. Like they do have some direct to phase 2 where you can skip phase 1 if you've already shown feasibility. They offer out of cycle, which means the due dates and everything are different than those deadlines that I mentioned. They also have rapid turnaround pitch topics with different budgets where they're looking to take something that actually is pretty far along in development or may have been used for another application and get it quickly into the hands of the warfighter to solve their problems. So they're looking for a quick turnaround in some programs. You have to remember that all of what the DOD does is mission driven. There's got to be some benefit to the warfighter or the services that support the warfighter, and that the topics and rules are component specific. And again, where components, of course, are Army, Navy, Air Force, Defense Logistics Agency, etc. DOD also makes it kind of complicated in how they issue their phases. So each component has their own guidelines and rules. Typically, phase 1 awards can range from 100,000 to 250. And by the way, if they have a cap and you exceed it by $1, you cannot be reviewed. So make sure you pay attention to that. Some agencies have increased the upper limits. Some will give you 6 months, some give you 12 months. But others require that you break that money down into the phase 1 base and an option. So if there's a base and an option at the end of your base, they're going to have you tell them what you plan to do on phase 2. And only if they intend to carry you on for phase 2 will they exercise the option. The intent is that it fills that gap between the phase 1 and the phase 2 and you keep doing your work. But the implication of that is much different than if there's no option, because you have to have proven feasibility and done the key work on your project in the base, or you're not going to have that data to report to support your phase 2. So it's vital that you understand that you have to demonstrate feasibility within the base period. And if there's a base and an option that's required, it's not optional. You have to do it that way. Phase 2s, of course, are based on the results of the phase 1. So remember, when they give an award on a particular topic, they may give 2, 3, or 4 awards on that specific topic. So you're competing with other companies specifically for that award. It means you're also going to be competing with those that receive the award to get funding on the phase 2. So one of the things you want to do as soon as once you get your award is make sure you go find out who else has the awards. What other technologies are they looking at, and what are you up against there? The other thing on phase 2 is DOD has got some unique programs for continuation funding where they can still keep funding you beyond the typical phase 2. Congress now allows them to give up to 3 sequential phase 2s, and they can develop their own mechanisms for doing it. DOD does it with enhancement programs, some of which require that you get an outside match from an investor to show that there's commercial pull. And that investor, by the way, could be part of DOD or outside. They may give you a sequential phase 2. It's not constant across the board where they offer these. So it's really important to be in contact with your program officer, your TPOC during the project, to find out if some of those things might be an option for you, because they, some of them are great advocates, really help you. They're wonderful. Others aren't so great. You really have to make sure you're watching out for yourself and know about these things. And then we come to that phase 3 that we've talked about as well. The thing that derives from, extends, or logically concludes efforts performed under a phase 1 or a phase 2. And within DOD, you do have to remember that often DOD is not going to be the customer, even though the ultimate end user. You certainly have to understand things like if there's a prime contractor relationship, what it is, who you need support from, who you need to work with in order to move into that phase 3. Most of you who deal with DOD are probably familiar with technology readiness levels. TRLs is a common way for you to communicate with the people at DOD about the status of your technology, both in terms of technology development and in how it's used in the field. So TRL 1 is like, I got a great idea. You can read what the definitions are. And by the way, if you're in software or something else, they do define TRLs more specifically than what I'm showing you here. This is kind of the broad definition. Phase 1s typically are going to be in a TRL 2, TRL 3 range. Phase 2 can take you probably up to say somewhere around a TRL 6, but it may not necessarily go that far. If TRLs are a new concept for you, you need to learn to communicate with TRLs, because you need to tell them where you're going to be, what your TRL is going to be when you're done with your phase 1, and basically show them you can communicate in their language. So that's at least shows you what the overlap tends to be for phase 2 funding. But that also shows you that to get from 7 to 9, you probably are going to have to come up with additional sources of funding, like I mentioned earlier. The stuff that DOD funds is all based on the communities of interest, and that's intended to strengthen coordination. You know, where Army's working with Navy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but they do have cross component programs that address these particular areas. And just so you're aware of them, DOD decides who participates in this program the same way the federal government does. If that particular component has an R&D budget of sufficient size, they participate in the program. And at the current time, the 14 that you see right here are the current ones. Space Development Agency is one of the newer. So like I said, there's 3 solicitation dates. So right here, we're coming up to the 21.2, 21.B. Point 2 is SBIR, point B is STTR. And I want to point out that there's an open period after the topics are released when you can talk to the program officer, to the TPOC, and answer questions, get them to answer questions about their applications and uses. That's vital, because they can tell you a lot of things that are not necessarily embedded in that topic. Now, some are very good about helping you and giving information, others aren't. But they are not able to speak to you starting, for example, on May 19th, no more discussion. So you have to be aware of those deadlines, look at the topics ahead of time and talk to them in that open period. If you miss it, you can also post questions in an online database called Citus. Even if you don't miss it, by the way, watch Citus, because other people will ask questions publicly that you can see the answers to, and it may be some benefit when you write your proposal. And DOD, you know, touts their success rate. They put out over 600 topics. They claim that a quarter of the awardees are first-time awardees that have never won a SBIR in the past. And again, over $1 billion a year. So, you know, it's a program definitely worth considering. And by the way, the reason those numbers are so old is they don't update them very often from DOD. But as all of you know, for every rule, there's of course the exception, and that plays out in spades at DOD. For example, DARPA and Space Defense Agency issue one broad agency announcement, and then they release topics on an ongoing basis during the year. So you're responding to that once a year BAA, but the topics come out sporadically. So you have to be aware of them, watch when they come out. Air Force does traditional SBIR and STTR, but they also have AFWERX topics that typically are open topics, more investigator initiated. Some involve pitch days where you come in and actually do a pitch and they give you an award by the time you leave. The objective is to turn this around very quickly and move on to commercialization. Army Spartan also does a broad agency announcement once a year, and topics come out, but they tend to be very short turnaround. So you have to be aware of those. And for those of you not particularly familiar with Spartan topics or the Spartan program, here's some information on it. It's part of the Army's Future Command, and they do have specific challenges that they're attempting to address. So currently as of the time I put these slides together, they had currently 31 topics open. They all have different due dates, so you got to be on your toes. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of a couple of agencies and how you can use this SBIR and STTR funding to benefit your company and take advantage of that golden ticket that I mentioned. If you have more questions after this, I'm very happy to talk to you. This is BBC's website, and there's a place where you can go fill out what we call the assessment form. So I have a little background on your company, and I'm willing to answer any questions that you have, tell you if you're eligible, give you advice for talking to the program officers, whatever you need. So take advantage of that. And by the way, any of you out there that are already real familiar with SBIR and STTR, we are hiring another DOD principal consultant right now. So if you know somebody, let them know we're hiring.
Thank you,
So
thank you, Becky. I actually didn't want to interrupt you because it was very meaty and substantive, and I used my judgment and decided to hold off on the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
But not now. You were too much on a roll and too much meat for everybody. You know, people probably writing notes and everything. It would have been very tragic for me to interrupt you like that. So let's see if we have time for a few questions. If you need to drop off at 1, if the questions go over, so far I don't have that many, but feel free to drop off. Really quick question, Becky, how many phase 3s have you done? Assisted smalls win.
I can't even begin to tell you. For one thing, remember, we're a consultancy, so nobody is required to come back and tell us what they did. So a lot of times we will help people and they then move on, and they don't even come back and tell us what they won or whatever. Where we have good statistics is in the state of Michigan, where we run the SBIR STTR support program, and their applicants tend to win at about double the national rate.
Okay. Elbert said, can we get some help on our SBIR proposals? I've submitted 4. Yeah, Elbert, go ahead and just contact Becky afterwards.
Happy to talk to you.
Yeah, happy.
No obligation.
I'm looking through the chat for all your questions, guys.
As you can tell, I'm enthusiastic about this program. It's helped countless companies. And so I apologize, I took more of your afternoon than you really wanted, but hopefully you found it useful. Any
other questions? Please put in your chat box. Can I get Becky's email? Yeah, Becky will put her email in the chat box. It's right here on the screen, guys. Also.
And everybody's welcome, by the way, to have the slides if you're interested in having a copy of the slides.
Mm-hmm. And there'll be a recording of this, so you can share that with anybody on your teams, companies, or friends that missed this. It's being recorded and available. So any other questions, anybody? This was a great event, and I really appreciate this. Is exactly the kind of thing that Cornerstones, you know, this is one of ours that we've had plenty of that are exactly on point. And this is another one exactly on point of what we're trying to offer our members and others, you know, our friends that want to join, to open everybody. And if anybody has a topic they want to cover, please let me know. And also we can do 201 with Becky and maybe do a short little Q&A, because we don't have a lot of Q&A time today. Maybe she'll, you know, in a few months, she can take 20 minutes or something, and we can just ask high-level questions of her instead of a presentation. No, the recording is not going to be emailed to you. It'll be available at the DEF website, or just contact me. I'll put my, there's my email. Contact me and I'll send it to you. Okay, thanks everybody. It was a great event. Thank you.
Thanks, Jed.
Pleasure.
Have a great afternoon.